welcome to this, the first keynote session of what is, alas, our last day. And it's my very great pleasure to chair the session and to introduce Professor Johannes Roessler, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Warwick University. He's published articles on issues in epistemology and the philosophy of mind and action, and he's co-edited 3 interdisciplinary volumes, and I asked him what the disciplines involved were, and they were philosophy and psychology, so right up our street. So his most recent book, published by Oxford University Press, is Perception, Causation and Objectivity. And he's going to talk to us about reason explanation and the second-person perspective. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks for the invitation. It's very exciting to be here and to share in this exciting sense that there is a topic in the making. I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to try out some new material, which I think it's fair to characterize as exploratory. So I'm trying to understand the role of the second person in an area that is usually considered hostile territory, the area of action explanation, or as psychologists like to put it, theory of mind. So this is going to be a pretty much straightforward philosophy talk, but I should say that I got going on this by doing joint work with a psychologist, Joseph Perner, and so I should acknowledge his influence. So we've been doing work on children's understanding of intentional action, and this is sort of an outgrowth of that line of investigation. Okay, my starting point is an observation Michael Thompson recently made about the kinds of examples Elizabeth Anscombe and Donald Davidson use to illustrate their respective views on intentional action. So here is a characteristic Davidsonian example of intentional action. Suppose that a man boards an aeroplane marked London. His reason was that he wanted to travel to London, England, and that he believed that the plane he boarded was headed for London, England. Needless to say, he was quite wrong about that. And here is a characteristically Anscombian example. Why are you setting up a camera on that pavement? Marilyn Monroe is going to pass by. Okay, so there are 2 salient respects in which these examples, and they really are illustrative examples of the sorts of stories you get in Davidson and Anscombe. 2 salient respects in which these examples differ. First, tense, or more precisely, tense and aspect. Davidson's example is in the past tense and involves the perfective aspect. We're talking about an action that has taken place. Anscombe's example is firmly set in the present tense and involves the progressive aspect. We're talking about an action that is unfolding as we speak. Okay, the second respect, of course, is that Davidson's example is in the third person and Anscombe's in the second person. Okay, so here is Thompson's summary. Anscombe's standard examples are not only progressive and imperfective and in medias res, but typically first person in character, or rather, as we might say, first and second person. Okay, so Thompson refers to, in this context, speaks of Anscombe's fundamental scene, and basically Anscombe's fundamental scene goes as follows. Here is what Thompson calls Anscombe's fundamental scene. You see someone doing something. For example, you observe someone setting up their camera. You then establish a cognitive relation with that agent. And you do that by asking him or her a question. You ask the question, why are you doing such and such? Okay. So this little description gives you what Thompson calls Anscombe's fundamental scene, and the kind of scene that really does an enormous amount of work in Anscombe's discussion of intentional action. Okay, so here is my agenda, my plan. I want to go slowly and look in a bit more detail at the role of the second person question, why? Why are you doing such and such in Anscombe's account of intentional action? And in particular, what's the significance of this question being put in the second person? I then want to go on to suggest that reflection on the Anscombe fundamental scene encourages a view of action explanation which is really at odds with current orthodoxy. So I want to contrast two conceptions of intentional explanation, i.e. explanation of intentional actions, which I call rationalization versus reason explanation. And then I want to pursue a little bit the debate between these views. So this I think, is really an area that needs an awful lot of work to be done on it, and other people have started on this. I'm only just going to be able to give you a glimpse of what I take to be the debate and how we might understand the debate between these views. All right, so we might start by reminding ourselves of Anscombe's central thesis. Anscombe claims that intentional actions are the actions to which a certain sense of the question why is given application. The sense is, of course, that in which the answer, if positive, gives a reason for acting. Okay, so notice that Anscombe isn't trying to explain what intentional action is in terms of some particular causal story or some sort of explanation which intentional actions are essentially susceptible to. She's simply saying that an intentional action is an action to which a certain question has application. Okay, so question, why does it matter that the question she's interested in, why, is formulated with the use of the second person? Why does it have to be a second person question? Why couldn't it be a third person question? So let's just ask, what's the difference between these questions anyway? Why are you setting up your camera? Why is she setting up her camera? In particular, is there any sort of differential expectation as to what counts as a good answer to these questions? Aren't they really completely on a par? Well, one way to make the issue vivid is to compare and contrast our pair with another pair of questions that are asked not about an intentional action, but we might think of a case of limping where it's just understood that this is not kind of intentional or feigned or anything, but someone is just genuinely limping and we want to know why. Okay, here is an intuition. In the limping case, there really isn't any significant difference between the third and the second person version of the question. Of course, they're grammatically different and so on, but they do not introduce different expectations as to what counts as a good answer. The answer in both cases might be, for example, I have been skiing, therefore I'm limping, and then of course this needs filling in, or she has been skiing, therefore she's limping. So basically what we are after is some kind of causal explanation. In the case of intentional actions, things would seem to be different. And the difference is nicely brought out in a famous quote by Austen, which is not about actions, but about beliefs. But I'll just give you the quote, which I think kind of crystallizes our intuitions here. Either question, how do you know, or why do you believe, may well be asked out of a respectful curiosity from a genuine desire to learn. But again, they may both be asked as pointed questions. How do you know suggests that perhaps you don't know it at all. Whereas, why do you believe suggests that you oughtn't to believe. So the important point about the question, why do you believe, is that it raises a normative question. Is it the case that you ought to believe? And similarly, in the case of intentional actions, the question, why are you doing such and such, raises the normative question, should you be doing such and such? Okay. So that is, I take it, precisely what Anscombe has in mind. 1a, unlike 1b, is a reason-seeking question. A good answer to 1a is expected to consist of a normative reason for performing the action, i.e. a normative reason that tells us how it is that you ought to perform the action in some basic sense of ought. So I'd use the term normative reason as Stephen did yesterday in the now standard sense of a consideration that counts in favor of performing the action. Okay, now let's pause for a moment and think a bit more about the notion of a reason, because that notion can be quite treacherous. We use the notion of a reason in many ways. One way in which we talk about reasons is simply as an explanation. Of course, both 1a and 1b ask about explanations. Any why question asks for an explanation. So in that sense, any why question will be about a reason why something is happening. When I characterize 1a as a reason-seeking question, I'm not talking about a question that seeks a reason in the sense of explanation, but I'm talking about a question that seeks a reason in the sense of a normative reason, i.e. a set of considerations that count in favor or recommend or support acting in that way. So that's I take it, a basic distinction we need to bear in mind whenever we think about reasons. Are we simply asking about explanations, or are we talking about normative or justifying reasons? So this is just in parenthesis. Reason might refer to explanation, as in the reason the volcano erupted when it did was that. But here I'm talking about reasons in the sense of normative reasons, and they are surely naturally seen as facts or considerations that count in favor of an action. Then there is a further complication. Some people think we need a third notion of a reason because they think that false beliefs can also provide one with a reason. So here is a famous example of Bernard Williams's. Suppose you falsely believe that the bottle in front of you contains gin, when in actual fact it contains petrol. So should we say that given your desire for a gin and tonic, you have a reason to mix the stuff with tonic and drink it? Some people will say yes, because you believe that it contains gin. And here I just want to remind you of Williams's own answer to that question. He says, well, actually, no, you don't, though you think you do. So partly out of kind of parsimony reasons, I'm going to try to restrict myself to just two notions of reasons: normative reasons and reasons in the sense of explanation. I'll come back to the issue of false beliefs, but let's bracket that issue for the moment. Okay, so let me just spell out the Anscombe picture of reason explanation by looking at her own examples. So here is a nice quote from Anscombe, which kind of gives you the spirit in which she thinks about reason, about action explanation. Roughly speaking, it establishes something as a reason if one argues against it. So Anscombe's fundamental scene is basically the scene in which you get distinctive kinds of debates and arguments. Okay, so let me illustrate. There are in particular two directions in which Anscombe's fundamental scene can develop, and in particular can involve argument. There is issues about the means being used to pursue a given end. Here's another example of hers. Why are you going upstairs? To get my camera. But your camera is in the cellar. Okay, so notice that we're talking about action explanation here. The question why is surely a question about an explanation for a particular action. But we're talking about an explanation where it is assumed that the explanans is a normative reason, and therefore is open to distinctive kind of further interrogation. For example, to get my camera is not a particularly good normative reason if the camera is actually in the cellar. A second sort of direction in which the debate can go concerns the choice-worthiness of ends. Why did you do it? Here's another example from Anscombe. Because he told me to. You did it because he told you to? But why do what he says? He has done a lot for me. Okay, so in the terms she later introduces, what the last answer does, it gives you a desirability characteristic for the action. So the questioner, after the first answer, is still at a loss to see what it is about the end that is supposed to be desirable. Why the fact that in doing something I do what he tells me to do, why should that be taken to count in favor of doing it? And that's the kind of puzzlement that the second answer does some way to alleviate, because it connects the thing with issues of gratitude, so it suggests it's only fitting for me, or it's only right or appropriate for me to do what he says, and so on. Okay, so this is just by way of illustrating Anscombe's, as it were, somewhat more hands-on view of what action explanation involves. It involves real debate about real normative reasons. Okay, just summarizing Anscombe's view. If an action is intentional, then the second person reason-seeking question has application. In central cases, a good answer to that question consists of setting out the agent's normative reasons for acting, okay, as we have seen. Again, in central cases, this involves a calculative relationship between something that is in some way desirable or good and some way to attain it. And I'll just give you two very helpful glosses by Candice Vogler on this view, which I think helps to bring out the spirit of Anscombe's discussion or Anscombe's view. Why are you doing that? And what's the point of doing that? And what's the good of doing that are basically the same question. Giving that question application is implicitly acknowledging that intentional action as such can be discussed in terms of its good, its desirability, its point. Okay, and we might then, just to go back to our initial pair of examples, the difference between the second person and the third person question, we might say, is that the second person question introduces a very distinctive expectation as to what counts as a good answer. The canonical way to answer the second person question is to give a normative reason, of which, for example, the fact that Marilyn Monroe is going to pass by will be a salient part. Of course, it won't be a complete statement of that reason, but it's the thing that matters. Whereas the third person question can be answered in all kinds of helpful ways. So the third person question might be asked in the very same way, but it might also be, it might be answered in the same way, might also be answered by referring to the agent's belief, and indeed it might be answered by referring to the agent's mistaken belief. Okay. So that completes the first part of the talk, which was just a matter of looking in some detail at Anscombe's use of the second person question. Now the question is, why is that important? Why is it not actually entirely trivial that we use the second person question in this way? Is this not something anyone will be happy to agree with? Perhaps yes, where you might think they ought to, because it does seem a fairly sort of suggestive description of the role of the second person question in our thinking about intentional actions. But it turns out that actually it is completely at loggerheads with what is considered to be common sense in recent philosophical discussions of reason explanation. And to illustrate that, here is a quote from J. Wallace, where he distinguishes two standpoints we are supposed to occupy on practical reasons. So this is supposed to be common sense. When we address the question of motivation, i.e. action explanation, we typically focus on an action that has already been performed, and we think about the action from a distinctively third-personal perspective. By contrast, the perspective within which normative reasons have their place is characteristically prospective, first-personal, and deliberative. It's the point of view from which I weigh the considerations for and against the various courses of action that are open to me, with the aim not of explaining something that has already occurred, but of resolving for myself the question of what is to be done. Okay, so the two important points is these two standpoints, deliberation and explanation, are supposed to exhaust our dealings with practical reasons. And B, the thing is supposed to be utter common sense. I mean, he just appeals to this as something everybody will be agreed on, and then he tries to draw out some implications which are a bit more controversial. But he takes this just to be obvious. So just to put it in the form of a box, which can be helpful, two perspectives, one to do with deliberation, i.e. establishing what I should be doing. This is, in temporal terms, of course, a matter of being related to the future. It involves the first person, typically the first person singular, though no doubt Wallace would be happy to accept that sometimes there can be first person plural deliberation. And clearly the subject matter is going to have to be normative reasons, because what I'm interested in is precisely considerations that count in favor of doing this or that. Then there is a completely different perspective to do with action explanation. Here, the temporal relation is retrospective. We're talking about something that has already happened, and we're asking, why has it happened? Why did such and such do such and such? So we're talking about a third-person perspective, and what we want, the subject matter, are not normative reasons, because we're not deciding to do anything. The subject matter is what he calls, and many other people call, motivating reasons, and these are basically beliefs and pro-attitudes, and in Wallace's view, also essentially, specifically, beliefs about normative reasons. So in the context of explanation, we're interested in the agent's beliefs about the normative reasons that he or she had. But it's just that we're interested in. We're not really interested in the normative reasons themselves. Okay, as I say, this is supposed to be common sense, and no doubt, I mean, there's some kind of vaguely Kantian echo here, I think, two standpoints and all that. But it seems to me one benefit of reflecting on Anscombe's work is just to bring out how far removed from common sense, from real common sense, this actually is. So, sorry, let me jump on Anscombe's view, or what Anscombe brings out is that very often our dealings with practical reasons involve the following perspective. We're talking to someone and trying to understand why they are doing what they're doing. So the action under consideration is unfolding as we speak. The fact we're talking about is a fact in the present progressive. We're interested in explanation, certainly, but we are interested in an explanation that provides a response to the pointed second-person question, to the reason-seeking question. So what we're really dealing with here are normative reasons. What we want is a good answer to the question, what reason do you have for doing such and such? Okay, now one way in which I think this contrast is of theoretical interest is that Wallace's kind of bifurcationist two-standpoint view strongly encourages a certain account, philosophical account, of what counts as a good explanation of intentional action. And this is the account which we may call rationalizing explanation. So the explanatory schema in terms of which we make intentional actions intelligible as such is neutral on whether the agent actually has a normative reason for acting. And of course, the standard version of rationalizing explanation is the view made popular by Davidson and others. Intentional actions are explained by the non-factive attitudes, specifically beliefs and desires or pro-attitudes, that make it rational for the agent to act. Okay, so on that view, normative reasons really drop out as far as action explanation is concerned. What matters is the agent's beliefs and desires, and perhaps beliefs about their normative reasons. But the question whether they really did have a normative reason is immaterial. Okay, in contrast, if you reflect on the Anscombe fundamental scene, it would seem quite natural to think about action explanation along the following lines, and I call this reason explanation. A basic way to make someone's intentional action intelligible as such is by coming to share the agent's view of her normative reasons, where this means you will understand the action in terms of the following explanatory schema. A is sighing because she has a good reason to. It's desirable in some way that she sigh, and sighing will best enable her to sigh. So this is, of course, to assume that all these second-personal questions that Anscombe illustrates have been given a satisfactory explanation. So it really is, you're kind of satisfied that there is some respect in which sighing is desirable, and that sighing really is the best way to achieve the aim of sighing. Okay, so this, as I say, is a sort of naive way of thinking about action explanation, which reflection on the second person might encourage. And then, of course, the philosophical question is, how seriously should we take the idea of action explanation? Sorry, of reason explanation. How seriously should or can we take the idea that what explains someone's intentionally doing something is actually the fact that they have a good reason, as opposed to rationalizing mental states like beliefs and desires. So that's the question. And there is a passage in Wallace's paper which might be thought to speak to that question. He says, in practice, of course, we often explain what people do without mentioning explicitly their psychological states, their beliefs and desires. For example, she left without saying goodbye because the store was about to close. And then he says, in the explanatory context, however, statements of this kind are naturally taken as abbreviated ways of characterizing the agent's state of mind. So Wallace seems to sense that there is something a bit counterintuitive about the rationalizing story, because after all, it seems entirely natural to say she left without saying goodbye because the store was about to close. But then he says, well, that's just a way of, an abbreviated way of saying she left without saying goodbye because she believed the store was about to close. Okay. Now that in itself seems quite peculiar, I have to say. I mean, normally it seems surprising to say that talking about the store is just an abbreviated way of talking about her beliefs about the store. It just doesn't seem to be true. But more importantly, I think what's sort of giving the game away is his reference to the explanatory context. He's simply assuming that we can kind of divvy up contexts neatly and intuitively in terms of deliberation on the one hand and explanation on the other. And that's precisely what Anscombe, I think, gives us reason to think is not how we ordinarily think about the explanation, intention, action. We're utterly familiar with a way of making sense of someone's intention, action where what we want is precisely a normative reason. Okay, so I take it that first response, which is kind of dismissive, which would be dismissive, it's just an abbreviated way, it really can't work. Here is a more serious concern. So here's a concern about the very idea of reason explanation. These explanations, on the face of it, aren't psychological. If you explain someone's doing something in terms of, she has a good reason to do it, after all, it's desirable in some way that such, and doing this is a good way of getting there, that's not a psychological explanation. It doesn't appeal to any mental states. And therefore, you might say, such explanations can't possibly be true. They're kind of weird teleological explanations. And we know that what explains people's behavior is what's going on in their brain. So we might just about be able to make sense of explanation in terms of mental states, but not in terms of real normative reasons. Okay, I think that's surely a big part of the reason why a reason explanation tends not to be taken very seriously. But I think it's a mistake. And let me just put it briefly. Certainly the explanation isn't overtly psychological. But it is entirely plausible to think that the explanation requires or assumes or takes for granted that the agent is aware of the considerations that are being appealed to. So, of course, if the fact that such and such is desirable and that doing so and so will get you there is to explain your action, you must be aware of those facts. If you weren't, of course, then there would be no explanatory link, or the explanatory link couldn't work. But that doesn't mean an explanation in terms of these facts known to you cannot be a good explanation. So we have a whole range of epistemic concepts, knowledge, appreciating that something is so, remembering, seeing that something is so, and so on, which we use to satisfy ourselves that this background condition is in place, that the agent really was aware or is aware of the relevant considerations. So the response to the second worry, I guess, would simply be that it's not overtly psychological, but it is psychological insofar as it assumes, as the explanation assumes, that the considerations are known, and knowledge, of course, is a mental concept. Okay, so there is nothing really weird about such explanations unless you find explanations in terms of knowledge weird. Okay, so that's, of course, would be a further issue. And indeed, the next issue that might be raised, you might say that appeal to factive states, such as knowledge or appreciating that something is the case, is explanatorily redundant. It really doesn't add anything to our explanation. And this is how Jonathan Dancy puts the point. it's not required for the purpose of explanation that the agent be right about things. So as far as action explanation is concerned, we are always well advised to simply focus on non-factive states like belief or pro-attitudes of various kinds. We don't really have to bother with the question whether the agent is right about things, because he would have acted anyway, even had he been wrong. Okay, so that's, I take it, is the real crux of the argument. And of course, one immediate point is, yes, of course, it is possible, very often at least, to make sense of an intentional action that is informed by false beliefs or perhaps by flawed values and so on. So it's certainly true that you don't absolutely need a normative reason in order to make sense of someone's doing something intentionally. So that's true. But then the next point is that it doesn't follow from this that normative reasons are never explanatorily relevant. It just would be a non sequitur to move from the fact that we can always, in particular cases, explain an action in terms of non-factive states to the conclusion that factive states, like knowledge, are never explanatorily relevant. Okay, and so at this point, I think defenders of reason explanation will want to go down a route that is known in contemporary philosophy as disjunctivism. So I think at this point, a defender of the idea of reason explanation will wish to embrace a disjunctivist account. Because a disjunctivist account, as I'm going to explain now, would promise an effective response to this third sort of concern. So here is how you might, roughly how you might spell out a disjunctivist picture of intentional explanation. And this is following Jen Hornsby's work in her 2008 paper. So we might say that explaining A is intentionally phi-ing can be a matter of two things. So two disjuncts come into place. It can be a matter of identifying a set of considerations that provide A with a reason for phi-ing, and then explaining A's phi-ing in terms of her appreciation of that reason. So here we are talking about a real normative reason which A has and of which A is aware, and we explain the action in terms of A's appreciation of that reason. Or it may be a matter of finding that from A's perspective, it seems as if certain considerations provide her with a reason to phi, and then we might explain her phi-ing in terms of that appearance. So the second disjunct involves something like a sort of error theory. We have to explain how, although A does not have a normative reason to phi, it nevertheless seems from A's perspective as if he did. And then we can explain the action in terms of that perspective, which we can talk about and identify without endorsing. So we can say this is it seems as if there is a reason even though there is none. Okay, now the important point is that disjunctivists will want to say that our understanding of how beliefs and desires explain action actually depends on our understanding of the good case. So the good case being A, where there really is a normative reason. So we can't really take the explanatory link between beliefs and desires and intentional actions as utterly basic. What is basic is the explanatory link between normative reasons and intentional actions. And then once we have that in place, we can of course also understand how the mere appearance of a normative reason might also be explanatory of someone's doing something. But the disjunctivist, as here, as in the case, in the more kind of the better known case of perceptual experience, the disjunctivist will say that the good case is the basic one, is the one which is fundamental to our understanding of the whole situation. So we can only make sense of misguided or actions premised on false beliefs or flawed values as sort of deviations from a norm, which is the basic case, the good case, where someone acts for normative reasons. Okay, I want to just to suggest that people react to disjunctivist proposals in different areas, in different ways. There are people who think this is really common sense, and there are people who think disjunctivism is a very weird, peculiarly British sort of philosophical theory. This is Tyler Burge. I want to suggest that I want to use an example to bring out that there is actually something commonsensical about disjunctivism. And to do so, I think we have to reflect on or to consult someone who really knows about common sense psychology. Someone who really knows about common sense psychology is Jane Austen. So here is Jane Austen on the puzzle. Here's a puzzle. I won't be able to fill in the story, but basically the setup is Charlotte Lucas mysteriously has just agreed to marry Mr. Collins, of all people. And Lizzie has great trouble making sense of this peculiar choice. So, engaged to Mr. Collins, my dear Charlotte, impossible. I see what you're feeling, replied Charlotte. You must be surprised, very much surprised, so lately as Mr. Collins was wishing to marry you. But when you have had time to think it all over, I hope you will be satisfied with what I've done. I'm not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins' character, connections, and situation in life, I'm convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state. Elizabeth quietly answered, undoubtedly. And after an awkward pause, they returned to the rest of the family. So one nice, helpful lesson from this passage, I think, is here is something about the second person which tends to be forgotten. The second person perspective can be awkward. So basically, Liz is trying to understand Charlotte's actions in terms of normative reasons. And this is what Charlotte is trying very hard to make possible by setting out the considerations there are to be appealed to in favor of her marrying Mr. Collins. Just as obviously, she doesn't succeed. So at the end of this conversation, the action still looks as mysterious and unintelligible to Liz as before. Okay, so this would seem to be, in terms of the disjunctivist picture, this is where the good case gives out. You can't really make sense of that action in terms of a real reason available to the agent. Because there isn't, there couldn't, if you know Mr. Collins, you know that there couldn't possibly be a real reason for marrying him. That doesn't mean the action really remains unintelligible, because, of course, Lizzie goes away and thinks about things from the third person perspective. So at this point, the second disjunct kicks in, and roughly, I'll just give you one line. She had always felt that Charlotte's opinion of matrimony was not exactly like her own, but she could not have supposed it possible that when called into action, Charlotte would have sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. Okay, so what Lizzie is constructing here is basically an error theory of how, despite the fact that there was no reason, there could not have been a good reason to marry Mr. Collins, it nevertheless looked from Charlotte's perspective as if there was. And of course, I think what's interesting about Jane Austen is that she gives us a real sense of the complexity and richness of common sense psychology. So what Lizzie is appealing to here, I think, is a defect of character. It's disappointingly and sadly, it has to be said that Charlotte's character is a bit too materialist, perhaps, or something. Anyhow, she it's not beyond sacrificing every better feeling. So that is part of a complex story that explains how, although there is no reason, it appears from Charlotte's perspective as if there were one. Okay, how am I doing for time? Have I got 10 minutes?
You have indeed got 10 minutes, absolutely.
Okay, so I just want to wind up by pursuing a little further on a slightly more kind of theoretically elevated level, the debate between rationalizing explanation and reason explanation. And I think, so there are, needless to say, a whole bunch of issues, but I think one very significant issue is the question of what explains how do we, common sense psychologists, not philosophers, but all of us common sense psychologists, understand the explanatory link between beliefs and pro-attitudes on the one hand and actions on the other. So this, of course, the idea that there is some such explanatory link is absolutely essential to the rationalizing explanation picture, because on that picture, understanding someone acting intentionally just is a matter of explaining an action in terms of beliefs and pro-attitudes. So the question is, how is appeal to beliefs and pro-attitudes explanatory? What accounts for the explanatory force of appeal to beliefs and pro-attitudes? Okay, so this is, I think, an area where a defender of reason explanation will or should present a challenge to rationalizing explanation, to the standard view, as it were. So the basic shape of the challenge would be, this is a question that is absolutely essential for the rationalizing explanation view. Perhaps on closer reflection, it turns out only reason explanation can give us an answer of how we understand the explanatory link between beliefs and pro-attitudes and intention action. So it would be kind of turning the tables on the on the orthodox rationalizing explanation picture. And as I say, I'm only going to be able to do a few elementary moves here. So here is one possible answer to the question of how we understand that explanatory link. A kind of an uncompromising theory theorist might say, we have a theory involving law-like generalizations that specify how people's beliefs and desires tend to affect their behavior. Okay, that is, I take it, an unattractive direction in which to go for many reasons. One reason being that it sort of severs the link between intentional action and normativity. It suggests that intentional action is just action explained by certain dispositions we have, but whether there is anything to be said for acting in that way is utterly irrelevant to the project of explanation. So I take it most thinking advocates of rationalizing explanation will not be tempted to go down that route. They will be much more likely to say something like this. We understand the explanatory role of beliefs and desires in normative terms. In particular, we understand that given a suitable set of attitudes, beliefs and desires, it makes sense for the agent to do X. Okay, so then the next move is to point out that defenders of rationalization will need to explain these normative terms in a way that is independent of or neutral on the agent's possession of real normative reasons, because real normative reasons are supposed to be irrelevant when it comes to action explanation. So we need some understanding of the normativity that goes with understanding the link between beliefs and pro-attitudes and actions. That, on the other hand, does not bring in real normative reasons. Okay, and that's, you can see that there may be a problem here. And I think the best way to push this sort of view would be to appeal to an idea that's been much discussed recently, that there are two kinds of normativity. We need to distinguish the ought of reasons from the ought of rationality. So this is from a 2005 paper by Nico Kolodny, which has sparked much debate. You might say there are two kinds of ought. An ought of reason goes like this. You ought to leave the hotel. You have reason to. The building is on fire. So the fact that the building is on fire gives you a reason to leave as quickly as possible, no doubt together with your preferences and so on. That's one kind of ought. Another kind of ought is the ought of rationality. Given your belief that the hotel is on fire, you ought to leave. It would be quite irrational if you're not to leave. Okay, now notice that the second ought, the putative ought of rationality, is completely non-committal on whether the hotel really is on fire. It's the fact that you believe it to be on fire, which is supposed to entail that you ought to leave, because otherwise you would be charged with irrationality. So just to bring out the distinction, this is a quote from Kolodny, when we say you ought to in the ought of reason sense, we usually seem to be saying something about the relation between your situation, i.e. the actual world around you, and your attitudes or actions. When we say you ought to in the sense of it would be irrational for you not to, i.e. in the ought of rationality sense, we seem to be saying something about the relation between your attitudes viewed in abstraction from the reasons for them. So notice that Kolodny, just like I've been doing throughout the talk, uses reasons for normative reasons where these are naturally thought of as typically non-psychological facts or considerations, e.g. the hotel is on fire. And then the thought is that there is an ought of rationality which is quite independent of what reasons you actually have. It's just a matter of the relations amongst your non-factive attitudes, such as beliefs. Okay, so this, I take it, is the most promising route to pursue for defenders of rationalizing explanation. And then basically the challenge, the note on which I want to end is that it is not at all obvious that there really is such a thing as an ought of rationality at all. And one way to bring this out is by noting the assumption, which really does a lot of work in Kolodny's discussion, that normative facts, whether ought of reason or ought of rationality, can be the subject matter of advice. So notice that in both cases, he illustrates the ought, the distinctive type of ought we are talking about, by talking about a distinctive kind of advice. You ought to leave the hotel, you have reason to, the building is on fire, or you ought to leave the hotel given your belief. Okay. Now this, I think, is where we have some pause for thought, because it's not at all clear that this second kind of advice really makes sense. And this is something that has been very nicely pointed out by Jason Bridges recently. To regard yourself as giving advice in Kolodny's ought of rationality sense, you needn't have the remotest inclination to believe that there actually is reason to pursue the course of action your remark is encouraging. So you might be saying, given your belief that the hotel is on fire, you ought to leave, or else you'd be quite irrational. But of course you could say that even though you know full well that the hotel is not on fire. So then Bridges goes on to point out that presumably you believe that in making your remark there is a decent chance you'll induce him to adopt that course of action, something you do not think he has any reason to do. This is not advice giving, it's manipulation. Okay, so this line of thought would suggest that there is really something fishy and quite implausible about the very idea of a separate ought of rationality. Okay, so the only real ought, you might say, is the ought of reasons. If that's the case, however, then the rationalizing explanation defender will basically be back to the drawing board in trying to explain how we understand the explanatory link between beliefs and desires and intentional actions. Okay, so that's the shape of the challenge I wanted to lay out. And that's it. Thanks for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Extremely rich, beautifully teased out and lucid arguments. Lots to talk about. So, ladies and gentlemen, yes, hand at the back.
Thank you for that talk, which I enjoyed very much. I want to just make one remark about what you were talking about at the end. Wonder if there isn't a perfectly ordinary case in which we think you can give advice, although you think there is, in fact, no real normative reason to do what you're giving advice to the agent to do. And that's in cases where we have differences of conscience. So suppose I'm talking to an ultra-Orthodox Jew who's here at our conference and doesn't know what to do about diet, and shrimp is put before him, and he's under pressure, he feels uneasy, and so on, and I say to him, you ought not to eat the shrimp. Now, I think there's nothing wrong with eating the shrimp. I don't share these beliefs of his, but given that he's got them, I think he ought not to eat the shrimp. And so what I'm advising him to do is makes perfect sense. It has nothing to do with manipulation. I'm advising him not to violate his conscience. So my conscience differs from him, but I still don't think he should violate his conscience.
Okay, thank you. That's a very interesting case, but I would have thought there are two ways in which this might play out. In one kind of case, whilst of course you don't share his, you don't observe the same rules as he does, and so in that sense you don't share his outlook, you nevertheless sort of honor it. So you think it really gives him a reason. It would be awful for him to eat things he's not supposed to. So in that sense, you may perfectly well endorse the reason that he has. It may, in your view, it would be something really bad happening if he ate these things. So in that sense, I think it's different from, I mean, in that version, at least, it would be different from the case of advising when you think the person has no reason. Of course, you might think that those whole dietary requirements are really bogus and perhaps evil or something. And then, I agree, and if you'd still advise him, then you might get him to do something which you think is absolutely no reason, even for him, to do. But then I think you might say there is an element of manipulation, because you wouldn't be quite kind of upfront with him.
Don't you think there's a value in having a human being be true to himself?
Exactly. No, that was my first case, yes.
But even if you very much dislike what his self values as ideal. So consider the case of the French banning of headscarves in schools. I mean, I myself have strong negative attitudes towards headscarves, but I might very well think there was something wrong about forcing people to violate their conscience. Might very well advise the French Muslims to go ahead and send their children to school with headscarves.
Yes, I think that's exactly the kind of case I had in mind, where you respect someone's values even though you may not entirely share their outlook. But I think that is, so I would have thought, given the respect for their values, you can in some sense endorse the reasons you are offering them.
I was trying to pick a case where I have only negative attitudes towards the values of the other, but I'll
So the headscarf was one where you have negative.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess then if that's the case, then there may be a sense in which you're not entirely. I mean, you don't tell the whole story about what you see as their reasons. So, I mean, it may not be manipulation, but it may not be kind of utter frankness either.
Disrespect for the dignity of other human beings whose values I don't share, but whose consciences need to be true.
Yes.
It actually relates very much to the brilliant passage from Pride and Prejudice, in a sense. I mean, Lizzie Bennet is the point of consciousness, to use Lionel Trilling's phrase, of the novel. So it's her values that illuminate the novel as the fundamental values. So when Charlotte makes quite a calculated decision to marry the absolutely abominable Mr. Collins, but for really good material reasons, in a way, Lizzie's sympathies and our sympathies simply won't reach out to Charlotte's you. And I think in a way that relates a little bit to what Eleanor's saying. And it touches on something which you sort of hint at, which is slightly the dark side of second-person being, which is that we, in a sense, have a limited reach of our second-person stance towards another. I mean, I thought it was a particularly brilliant example there, because obviously later on she reflects on Charlotte's accession and sees it in rather objective terms as the kind of materialist decision a woman in her position would have to make.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just yes, gentleman there, hand, yeah.
Thank you very, very much for the talk. I want to ask about one of the responses that you gave concerning worries to this notion of reason explanation. You asked the question, how seriously should we take this? And you raised some possible problems for it, and you answered it. So one of the problems that you raised was that this is just a spooky teleological explanation. It doesn't refer to the brain or psychological states, and those are what are supposed to cause actions. And your answer was, well, yes, it's not explicitly psychological, but it's plausible that the agent must be aware of these normative reasons in order to act. So then I want to ask this question. You gave the example, why did she go to the store? Because it was closing. And you said, it's implausible to think that what was really going on there was the answer, well, she believed that the store was closing. That's not really what we're looking for. We're looking for the actual state of affairs there. But then the way that you answered it was that there was some awareness of the consideration that's induced. So I want to ask, how does that response just not slide back into beliefs about the way the world's the way the world is? Yes.
Good. No, thank you. That's helpful, because that's really doing a lot of work, and I can see that this may look like a subtle distinction, but the fact is that beliefs are not factive attitudes. So here is an important point about belief. You can have a belief that P, even if not P. Okay, whereas you cannot know that P if not P, or you can't appreciate that P if not P. So what I was saying is that the way to kind of demystify or despook reason explanation was to appreciate that an enabling condition of this kind of explanation is, of course, that the agent knows the relevant considerations. And then you might say, well, but then how is it really different from explanation in terms of belief? Well, because it's different because knowledge is a factive state. So you could only know if it's the case, and that means that we can helpfully, so it's still perfectly true to give the explanation just by appeal to the reasons. Of course, assuming all along that these are reasons of which the agent is aware. But bringing in knowledge, as it were, doesn't make appeal to normative reasons redundant or inappropriate. Whereas if the explanatory work is really just done by beliefs, then it would be quite strange and surprising to offer any kind of explanation in terms of facts that are reasons, because the thing about beliefs is you can have them even when the facts are not there. Okay, so that's why I think while the difference may look subtle, it's really quite momentous.
Thank you. Hand at the back. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Stephen, is it?
Thanks for this, Johannes. So you set this up as a contrast between two possibilities, rationalizing explanations on the one hand and reasons explanations on the other, and it's a necessary condition on reasons explanations that the reasons be genuine normative reasons. Of course, there's something in the middle that's sort of, it's been in play, I think, in some of the discussion already. It's the idea of the agent's reason, that is, explaining something by the agent's reason. And there are people, Dancy, for example, myself, a number of other people have argued that that's a distinctive kind of explanation. It's not merely rationalizing explanation because it doesn't go by the mental states. It goes by the believed propositions. So the agent's reason is not that she believes that P, it's that P. It's that the store is closing, for example, not that she believes the store is closing. So there it stands with what you're saying about reasons explanations. But where it departs from what you're saying about reasons explanations is that it's not necessary for somebody to take something as a reason and act on it, or even act for it, and hence for that to be her reason, either that it be true or that it be a reason even if it is true. And so the question I have, so first I just want to put that alternative on the table. So what you have to argue against is not just rationalizing explanation model, but also an agent's reason model on which it's not a necessary condition of something's being the agent's reason, either that it be true or that it actually be a normative reason. Now, under pressure, under dialectical pressure, you move to what you call the disjunctive view. So yes, it can happen that there is no reason for someone to do something, but we can explain her doing it because it seemed to her that it was a reason. Of course, on the agent's reason explanation, we just say, well, she took it as a reason, and that was her reason for doing it, and it's not necessary for it to be her reason for doing it, that it actually be a reason or that it actually be true. But so in that case, what seems to be doing the work is not the existence of the reason, because by hypothesis there isn't, it's that it seems to her to be a reason. I wonder about the other kind of case, though. Suppose there is a reason for the person to do something, but it doesn't seem to her as if there's a reason, okay? Suppose she denies that it's a reason. She just can't accept that it's a reason. But now then, suppose she actually goes ahead and does it anyway. And we could well ask her, why did you do that? Now, we're no doubt about whether there was a reason for her to do it. We believe there was a reason for her to do it. We think there's a normative reason for her to do it. But she doesn't think there is, and it doesn't seem to her that there is. It seems to me that would be a very puzzling thing to say, oh, we've explained what she's done because there is a reason for her to do it. If she denied it, didn't accept it, it didn't seem to her as if there was. So that's where that's why I'm puzzled by the disjunctive. I mean, in a way, I'm puzzled by the disjunctive account because all the work seems to be being done by the seeming that it's a reason. Because in the case where there is a reason, it doesn't seem clear that it's a reason. It's hard to see how we could explain her doing it.
Okay, thank you very much. On that last point first, so I suggested that anyone who's got any sympathy with the idea of reasoning explanation will, not just under dialectical pressure, but will be very happy to acknowledge that for such explanations to work, the reasons must be available to the agent, i.e. the agent has to know the relevant facts and indeed take them to be reasons. So it has to appreciate that these are reasons. So in the case you mentioned where someone has a reason but they think they don't, then of course the whole apparatus wouldn't kick in. Then we wouldn't expect to be able to make sense of what she's doing in terms of that reason, because that would require that the person appreciates the reason. But if she denies that there is such a reason, she doesn't appreciate it. So that I take it is, so that kind of case is not an immediate sort of objection to the or counterexample to the story. I take it.
So I thought the reason. So what was supposed to explain her action is a normative reason.
A normative reason available to her.
Okay, available to her.
Well, known. I mean, this was the bit about the explanation, not overtly psychological, but it's a kind of enabling condition of such an explanation that the agent be appreciative of these reasons.
Right. And it involves two things. First, that she's got to know. So suppose we think P is a normative reason, that the store is going to close, is a normative reason for her to go to the store. Okay. Now, there are two kinds of things that have to go on there in order for us to be able to explain her going to the store for that reason. First, she's got to know that the store is about to close.
Exactly.
Okay. But she also has to accept that that's a reason for her, because she might accept that, but just deny that that's any reason.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Okay. So then I'm just puzzled by why in the case where there is no reason, I'm just wondering whether this ends up, because actually it's not the reason by itself that explains, it's the reason, the appreciated reason that explains.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the idea is that we have to be disjunctivist about appearances, as it were. So appearances can be either appreciating a real reason or mere appearances, i.e. being under misapprehension.
Then I lose a sense of the contrast with Nancy's view.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to come back to. Thank you. You said that the Dancy view introduces a sort of third way, or relative to the way I've set things up. I think that's, strictly speaking, not quite right, because note that the way I've formulated rationalizing explanation is actually neutral on the debate between Dancy and Davidson, basically. So rationalizing explanation says the explanatory schema, in terms of which we make intentional actions intelligible as such, is neutral on whether the agent has a normative reason for acting. And so Dancy explicitly, so here's a quote from Dancy, it doesn't matter for the purpose of explanation whether the agent is right about things, i.e. whether the kinds of considerations the agent takes to count in favor of doing something are true and really do count in favor of doing something. So what I set out, the belief desire model, is just, as it were, the standard version of this neutral view. The neutral view is simply the idea that explaining intentional action as such is neutral on whether the agent really did have a normative reason. And this is, of course, something Dancy accommodates in a different way, in a non-standard way, by saying that the relevant notion of explanation is itself non-factive. So that the shop is about to close explains your leaving, can explain your leaving, even though it's actually not true that the shop is about to close. Right. So Dancy would, I think, wholeheartedly embrace the first bit, the idea that the explanatory schema is neutral, and just add a non-standard version, like spell it out in terms of a non-standard
but what
filling in.
Denies is that the action is explained by the attitude.
Yeah, so that's what's non-standard.
So he doesn't actually fit under rationalizing explanation as you've got it there.
Well, that doesn't fit the standard version. Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
Sorry?
It doesn't fit what I call the standard version of rationalizing explanation.
Oh.
But Dancy's view certainly does fit the general claim I put first, that the explanatory schema in terms of which we make attention actions intelligible is neutral on whether the agent has a normative reason. Okay.
Looks like both parties are now satisfied on this point, if I look at it. Andrew.
I want to thank you for your superb talk, and it's given me a lot of things to think about, which I'm going to take away and digest. And I'm also going to take my mother's advice for many years to read Jane Austen, so thank you very much for that. This distinction between rationalizing explanation and reason explanation, it triggered another thought from another book, and this was a book by C.S. Lewis called That Hideous Strength, and it was a kind of playground for certain philosophical ideas. There's one character in it, one of the bad characters, a certain Professor Frost. And Professor Frost is in love with objective thinking. His whole life is dedicated to objective thinking, to the point where towards the end he's described as no longer having reasons for action. He's got himself worked up into such a state that he's got rational reasons for doing certain things in the program that he's involved with, but he can't actually, he's no longer intelligible to himself as a reasoning agent. He can't articulate reasons for his own actions anymore. So there's another, perhaps a literary example of a distinction where almost it's gone the other way, and maybe that's a state that we can work ourselves into sometimes.
And actually we were discussing over breakfast a precise example of this with Stephen, I think, almost, not quite Professor Frost, but a nice character in this case in whose actions are simply insufficiently determined by any reasons. But sorry to interrupt that.
Thank you. No, well, I'll certainly go away and read C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yes, I think there are two hands, I think, or there's two hands and a pencil. So can I go for the pencil first?
Thank
sorry,
you.
that was in front of the pencil. Yes, yeah.
Whatever. Thank you so much. Lucid, fascinating, and I think really important talk. What comes to my mind in this distinction is the thought of how this might play out in a court of law as a way of heightening what could be at stake. And I find myself thinking of the recent, very widely read about case in the US of the shooting of an unarmed black youth, Trayvon Martin. And the reason given for the acquittal of the man who shot him was that he believed that this youth was endangering his life. And it's just a very interesting case study of uses of different kinds. This was a non-factual belief. And one would think in a court of law that there would be other normative reasons that would come into play in terms of thinking about, assessing this action. But in fact, what became determinative was what you call the rationalization based on what he believed to be the case, whether or not it was in fact the case. And I don't know if you'd want to, would that be how would you view that as an application of the kinds of distinctions you're making?
Okay, I take it the issue there is whether the belief appealed to counts as an excuse. Where I guess that in turn depends on issues as to how we should make sense of that very belief. And I take it the kind of implication was perhaps, or was meant to be, that the person had every reason to have this belief, so that it looked like a well-established, or it seemed like there may have been good reason for that belief, and I suppose the subtle issues are whether what sorts of factors might have been in play in generating that belief. So, yes.
This is a very interesting example. I wonder if we could tease out a bit more, because, the belief was seen not merely to be unreasonable belief, but actually prejudicial, the assumption that an Afro-Caribbean person or an African-American person would be a threat. And so it was the feeling that there was a prejudice being pandered to, allowing the person who murdered.
Exactly.
And I just wondered whether you could explore that a bit further, the difference between, as it were, a reasonable belief and prejudice and so on.
Well, I guess in
that's,
the thank you. In the sort of in a disjunctivist framework, I suppose, this would come in under the rich and complex and interesting ways in which common sense psychology explains the mere appearance of reasons when there are none. So I think, I mean, I can see that people are puzzled by disjunctivism in this area as in other areas, because they think it's just clear that the kind of bottom line is the case where you have a belief and desire, and that we can understand how they work independently of whether we're talking about a good case or a bad case. But I think one potential virtue, of a disjunctivist approach might be to question something that the sort of standard view takes for granted, namely that making sense of intentional action is really quite easy. So on the Davidsonian view, what you need to understand someone as acting intentionally is basically a belief and desire, and you kind of put them together in the right way, and there you go. Whereas it would seem, if you take it that the basic case is one where you have to be able to make sense of the action in terms of a normative reason, then it can be quite hard. I mean, then the real work will need to be done, how, even though there is no normative reason, the agent, it nevertheless appeared to the agent as if there were. Now, of course, in some cases, that is, nothing could be easier if there is a false belief and so on. But then there are all kinds of factors that common sense psychology is kind of familiar with, for example, and Jane Austen is kind of virtuoso at displaying, and which may also affect the sorts of cases you were talking about, to do with prejudice or character and things like that.
Yeah. Lady with the pencil. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I agreed with almost everything, I think. But I have a question about an initial contrast that you make between the third-person question, why is she limping? And the second-person question, why are you limping? And then an intentional action on the other hand, why are you setting up a camera, and why is she setting up a camera? And I was thinking about a case where you're asking someone, why are you crying? And why is she crying? It seems as if there we have a case of intuitively not an intentional action, but where we still see the distinction between the you question and the she question. Yeah. And the distinction can be, I mean, it can be explicated in the following way, that we expect the person to answer not as an observer of, you know, why she's limping, but of sort of articulating her self-conscious knowledge. I mean, articulating in a first-personal way why she's crying. But there we don't have the structure, it seems to me, of reason-giving explanation in your sense, but we still have a first-personal, we have a genuine second-person address and the expectation that the person is able to answer non-observationally. So this seems to me to be a case where we're interested in figuring out what the person, understanding the person, but not understanding the person in terms of reasons in your sense.
Okay.
So what?
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So you're basically okay with the contrast between setting up your camera and limping? Yes. Because you might also say that even the limping case in real life will perhaps be a bit more complex, because even though it's clear that perhaps you're not really doing it for fun, I mean, people often don't take the fact that it's not intentional to be a reason not to ask pointed questions. So it could be, even the limping case could be a bit more complex. I take it the crying case raises issues about, presumably we're talking about an explanation of emotion here. And then one suggestion might be, well, of course we're not talking about reasons for action here, but we're talking about reasons for emotions. And they are distinctive and in many ways utterly unlike reasons for action, but they still belong to the broad category of normative reasons as set out by Stephen yesterday. So you might what you want to know is what is there to be sad about? Or what's, so I mean, those sorts of issues might come into play.
Yes, that's one way to go, but I think, I mean, it might be difficult to sort of analyze, I mean, to keep the strong notion of a normative reason that you want here in place in order to understand what's going on when we try to figure out what's there to be sad about. Because it does seem like there's much more room for the person to make herself intelligible in a way that just is merely perhaps based on her way of associating or her personal history and sort of a...
Yes, okay, so perhaps the starting point might be what you want in that sort of case is a way of making sense of what's going on, where we might then, in a separate step, think about what sorts of materials might go into making sense, which might involve normative reasons as elements, but also various other kinds of materials. So I think that's a good question, and it's important to bear in mind that action is just one part of the story.
This is a particularly good example, I guess, because, I mean, crying is sometimes an event that happens to you and sometimes something you do. There's a difference between bursting into tears and turning on the waterworks for some particular reason. And I guess there's that complexity as well, isn't there? Anyway, sorry. So, as I say, yes, I'm sorry if I'm not getting people in the right order. Yes, the lady in front, and then I will go back to the back.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Beatrice.
And thank you very much. I'm just wondering, do you think developmental psychology can help with these distinctions? Basically looking at the development of children, how children actually assign reasons and normative reasons, whether it actually would help. And if so, how do you think it would pan out in development? How do children actually, do you think they first develop second person and then third person? Do you,
Okay.
What are your thoughts?
Thank you. That's very kind. Very, very nice question. So I take it most of you will be familiar with a so-called false belief task. So this is a task where children, 3- and 4-year-olds, are shown a story where a character puts a piece of chocolate in the cupboard, then goes out to play, and then his mum comes in and removes the chocolate, puts it elsewhere in the kitchen drawer, say, and then the test question is, where is Max going to go and look for his chocolate? Okay, it turns out that 3-year-olds reliably and indeed resolutely tell you, well, he's going to go to the kitchen drawer, i.e. to the place where the chocolate actually is, despite the fact that Max really had no way to know about the transfer of the chocolate. So this is what has led people to say that 3-year-olds have a problem understanding false belief, and they have a problem understanding the explanatory role of belief in action, relative to action. So they don't seem to get that what people do is typically a reflection of what they believe to be the case, where that belief may be false. Okay, so here is one. So as I said, I really got into this area through thinking about development. So here is one suggestion you might make about the false belief task. Really, children are the unsuccessful children, 3-year-olds, are trying to tackle this task from the second-person perspective. They expect Max to be going where they would recommend him to be going. They think of it from the perspective of advice. They think, this is where you ought to be going, Max. That's where the chocolate is. And then they expect Max to be going just there. Okay, so that's a kind of slightly crass and crude way of making a connection. But on the sort of view I've been working on with Joseph Perner, 3-year-olds have some understanding of intentional action. They understand that people do what it makes sense for them to do. What they do not have is an understanding of the role of perspective in making it the case that people do one thing rather than another. So 3-year-olds tend to assume that people do what they really have objective normative reason to do. And we've pursued that hypothesis by looking not just at the case of false belief, but also at the case of conflicting goals. So on this sort of hypothesis, 3-year-olds should also have a problem making sense of actions that pursue goals that are manifestly undesirable, or they should have a problem making sense of two actions simultaneously where these actions pursue conflicting goals, i.e. where you can't endorse one of the goals because you can't endorse both goals because they're mutually conflicting. So that's the sort of evidence that could be said to count in favor of the view that young children start off by thinking of intentional agents as simply responding to real reasons out there.
I don't know whether Vasu talked about
the microphone.
Sorry. I'm not sure whether Vasu talked the other day about this because I wasn't here, but we've just published a study where we were looking at babies' understanding of intentions and basically motor posture. There's a hand that goes and reaches for something, and the hand can be like that or like that. And basically, what we found is already 5-month-old babies have predictive gaze to the right target. So they actually understand that when your hand is like that, they go for the big ball. When it's like that, you go for the small ball. And I'm very puzzled, basically, that such young babies can actually understand intentions and actions, intentional actions, and it takes kind of 3 years to get, well, actually 4 years to get to false belief understanding. And I've done this study now with people with autism, and people with autism do as well. They do understand these intentional actions. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is how do we go from there very early on? Why does it take so long? And what do you think are kind of the different bits they need to get on the way?
Thanks. So I think it's important, you say understanding intentional action. Yes. So it's important to recognize that the kind of understanding I've been talking about is really quite a demanding and sort of high-tech ability. It involves identifying the reasons in terms of which the action can be seen as intelligible, or the kind of normative reasons, or perhaps just the agent's beliefs about normative reasons that make it unsurprising that they act in a certain way. So it's having a certain answer to the question why. Okay, I take it in that sense, 4 or 6 or 9-month-olds do not understand intentional actions because they're not in the business of asking why questions at all. So that, I think there is an initial thing about being able to engage with and recognize in some sense intentional actions, which is not probably a matter of having explanations for why people do things. So I mean, that's just a kind of immediate point.
It's talking later, so this is a taster for her talk this afternoon, so I must say I'm really looking forward to it. Have we got time, I think, for one more question? I apologise. Yes, I think the gentleman at the back, and I apologise if anybody else has got a ischemia of the upper limb from keeping it in the air. Perhaps there's one other. Have I been very unjust? I'll make room for one other. So 2 quick ones, thank you.
Okay. Perhaps one way to motivate a view that says that explanation of intentional actions must be neutral with respect to the facts, the factivity of the mental attitude, would involve cases of uncertainty on part of the person doing the explanation. So consider the following case. I ask Stephen, why are you holding the camera? He says, Marilyn Monroe is about to go. Marilyn Monroe is about to pass here. And I'm not sure whether Marilyn Monroe is indeed about to pass here. It seems to me that according to your view, now I'm in a state of uncertainty about the explanation. The explanation is either that Stephen is aware of that, or it is a different kind of explanation that he merely believes that. So if Uku now asks me, why is Stephen holding the camera? I have to tell him, well, I'm uncertain. It's either this, that he's aware of this fact, or he merely believes. But it doesn't seem right. It seems that I perfectly well know what the explanation is. And if I stand in the street and suddenly see Marilyn Monroe, I didn't learn anything new about what the explanation is.
A very quick answer to a very complex question.
Okay, very nice question. I think the matter is not obvious. So, of course, you're not uncertain about the explanation because you can always fall back to the bad case, as it were, he believes Marilyn Monroe is going to come by. So there isn't an issue about you really being uncertain about what's going on. But I think there is a sense, if you don't take his word for it, he tells you she's going to pass by, no doubt about it, and you don't accept that, then I think there is a sense in which your understanding of the action will be different from his.
Thank you. Just one final quick question with a quick answer. Thank you. I think we've identified somebody who definitely has been waiting a long time. The lady in the yellow, yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question to you, but I'm struggling myself with the question how to approach, from what direction to approach the question what normative reasons are. And I have the impression that you approach it through the question what an intentional action is, and then get to the bit what normative reasons are. But there are also many people who just start with the question what normative reasons are without regarding intentional actions. And so they might, and I have a sense that maybe Dancy and Kolodny are people like this, but I might be wrong about that anyway. But I have the sense that maybe they work with a different conception of what normative reasons are than you do. And I wonder whether that doesn't obscure the disagreement that you have with them. For instance, when you, the quote that was shown when Steve asked his question, when you say that Dancy's explanation model is neutral on whether the agent really has a normative reason, I think that is ambiguous. Having a normative reason can mean there being a normative reason or appreciating that there is a normative reason. And I'm not sure that Dancy is neutral on whether, or his explanation is neutral on whether the agent appreciates that there is a normative reason. Maybe he only wants to be neutral on the question whether the agent really has a normative reason, because he thinks that there is such a conception of there really being a normative reason without anyone knowing about it or appreciating it or whatever. But maybe you want to exclude that, and that's why you interpret having a normative reason as meaning appreciating a normative reason. And if that were the case, then indeed you're different from Dancy. But do you see what
I'm afraid you've got 15 seconds to answer that question. I'm really sorry, but you'll be able to continue the discussion over dinner. But just
give us really easy to answer. Thank you for that point. Good. So I think you're absolutely right that we need to be careful about that distinction between there being a reason and someone appreciating the reason. But I still think what Dancy wants to say is that the explanation itself is neutral on whether there really is a reason, because he thinks that explanation, that the concept explanation in this context is not a factive concept. So that's, I think, my main disagreement. I think on the other issues, so that main disagreement is neutral, as it were, on a lot of other issues in Dancy. But perhaps we can talk about it later. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.